Okay to go? Okay. So my title is Reconsidering the Distinction Between Partial and Full Writing Systems. I would stress that the sense of reconsidering in this title resonates at both the personal and the level of grapholinguistic research. At the personal level, I would immediately acknowledge that I presented earlier far sketchier musings on this topic back in 2019 at AWL 12. And while still very much a work in progress, I think, in reflecting marked shifts in my thinking about the key aspects since that time, I hope that this reconsideration is sufficiently more coherent and lucid to warrant sharing here. And certainly at the discipline level, I continue to firmly believe that this dichotomy warrants serious reconsidering within writing systems research for various implications for understanding writing systems. So after a few opening remarks, mainly tendering the talk's core aim and core proposal very much at the outset, the focus of the first section is on the dichotomy's implication for the scope of writing system topologies. In a shorter second section, I turn to the core proposal, essentially a call for greater attention on the graphematic mapping of lexical units rather than whole writing systems. And in the third section, I attempt to illustrate the continuum's implications with the case of the Japanese writing system. Finally, I will tender a few closing remarks. Within the overall framework, this talk is punctuated as a series of numbered blocks, mainly remarks and propositions highlighted in bold. So as preliminary details, it's prudent to establish some working definitions. And starting with writing systems, of course, there are two common meanings. First is the narrow range of abstract relationships between lexical units and graphemes. The second, of course, is the specific grapheme inventory and the use conventions for a particular language. So either within my talk section 1 and 2, sense 1 dominates, but in the shift to sense 2 in section 3 when I'm taking up the case of the Japanese writing system. Another definition, writing system topology, basically referring to the enterprise of developing coherent frameworks for classifying the diversity within writing systems. And the third that I would draw attention to is graphematic mapping. I'm using it here related to writing system meaning 1, referring to the principles of graphematic representation by which graphemes map to lexical units. And so I would, at this point, make my opening claim that partial and full dichotomy of deep significance for writing system topology. Certainly the distinction was discernible in Gelb, 1952, from the semasiographic to the full writing, but arguably the first prominence given in De Francis in his famous book, Partial Writing, a System of Graphic Symbols that can be used to convey only some thought, as opposed to full writing can be used to convey any and all thought. Well, of course, we immediately need to make some important caveats to this, more on both of these soon. But firstly, the dichotomy is really about the potentiality to represent language, not thought. It's a medium of thought. De Francis applied in differentiating non-writing and writing. Well, certainly the second point is valid when treated as a sharp dichotomy. However, for the issue of potentiality inherent in the first sense, it's more appropriate to regard as a continuum that is directly related to grapheme inventories. And so core proposal is to limit the use of polemic and synemic terms to describing the graphematic mapping of lexical units, not to whole writing systems. Of course, the terms were proposed by Haas in 76, 83 within his writing system topology based on 3 binary choices: derived, original, informed versus empty, and motivated versus arbitrary. However, only really the second directly pertains to writing systems, which based on the Greek words Haas also referred to as polemic. The graphemes are semantically informed in denoting both sounds and meanings, and synemic, the graphemes are semantically empty, only denoting sounds. So having declared this talk's core claim and the core proposal at the very outset, I will now endeavor to both explicate and defend both propositions. So the next section is on the scope of writing system topology, seeking to acknowledge de Francis's insight in applying the partial full dichotomy as essentially marking the boundary between non-writing and writing. So number 3, core challenge for writing systems in differentiating between the properties that are more significant, such as mapping, versus the more marginal ones, linearity. Various topology proposals have undoubtedly embodied different notions of writing and have employed alternative formats ranging from inverted tree figures to 1- or 2-dimensional arrays to decision table-like tables. Block 4. Writing system topologies have generated an abundance, perhaps a surplus, of contrastive binaries, including both dichotomies and continuums. The next 2 slides present a number of these, grouped mainly according to the hierarchical level. So at the most relevant level for the issue of writing system topology scope, most upper level binaries are seeking to differentiate partial from full writing, even though the distinction is often blurred with the semasiography term. At the mid-level, binaries have struggled over how to succinctly capture what is arguably the most elusive contrast, something that the phonemic and synemic binary can achieve. Sorry, how to sync. And then at the lower level binaries, we seek categories. Binaries seek to categorize phonographic writing systems, but also to focus on other properties such as grapheme structure. And also there have been alternatives such as deep and shallow, open and closed. But naturally, these binaries reflect the classification goal of the writing system topology. But a serious challenge for the terminology is to be both consistent and informative. So block 5, general consensus now that writing represents language. Within writing systems research, it's possible to discern a positive trend towards more language-orientated topologies, such as every system of writing in relation to that which all systems represent, Hill back in '67, or all writing systems represent elements of language, not ideas or something else, Sprout 2020. And language represents language, Daniels 2018. Now, noted regrettably confused interpretations about the nature of language are still encountered too frequently outside of this research field. A further fuller appreciation of the full partial dichotomy is particularly germane in that regard, almost to that point. So block 6, language as an abstract entity can be materialized in 3 ways: in speaking, writing, and signing. And of course, this is a difference between your auditory and visual modalities. Block 7, language is the combination of words, lexicon, and rules syntactic. Setting aside syntactic influences from a lexical perspective, the topologies really are concerned with just a 3-point triangle. As the lexicon is primarily concerned with morphology, the ideal labels would be morphology, phonology, and graphology. And just for the clarity of these correspondence alone, I believe that the term graphology warrants reclaiming for this field, certainly preferable to semantics, phonology, and orthography labels prevailing within psycholinguistic research on visual word recognition and reading. And if we were to pivot that triangle and to posit the linguistic levels on the morphology, phonology dimension, it becomes clearer that we are dealing with morphemes, syllables, and phonemes. Unfortunately, however, that reality is not readily apparent within most writing system topologies. So taking Daniels was one of the most influential, in spite of being the most influential over the last couple of decades. If one aligns this category labels along this dimension, the picture becomes highly muddled indeed. Daniels' exemplar-based category terms essentially obscure the significance of the syllables, for which his own he has stressed himself in his accounts of grammatogenity. But also we can see the important dividing line, which I would see on the next slide. I would also, of course, acknowledge that Daniel's 2018 version subsumes the feature category as an alphabet. Block 10, upper level boundaries demark the key boundary between semiotics and the topology. At the heart of de France's partial full sharp dichotomy is the valid conviction that graphemes are functional writing systems mapped to linguistic units, either at these three levels. The dichotomy is also a key reason for not using logography term within writing systems research, I think, as Daniel's 2018 explicitly admits. Within topologies, morphography would actually be preferable to logography because it's simply untenable to have separate graphemes for every word, and the notion of morphography covers both free words and bound morphemes anyway. Okay, so the next section, a shorter section, essentially advocating the greater attention to the graphematic mapping of lexical units. Beyond the range of topology binaries already introduced and Daniel's categories already mentioned, in the interest of brevity, one further example must serve to exemplify this exertion that writing systems topologies proposals classify writing systems according to a single dominant principle. However, that's seriously flawed, as multiple mappings often coexist. Most writing systems are to varying degrees mixed in nature. Undoubtedly, identifying the dominant mapping greatly contributes to developing more coherent classification frameworks. However, the basic strategy also yields problematic terms such as alphabetic principle or logographic principle that compound inappropriate terms with gross simplification. So 13, appropriate to appreciate the partial and full binary as actually a continuum within glottographic writing systems. The mapping consistencies that we observe mainly reflect deficiencies in the inventories in the first place, or the propensity for mapping principles to become more lexically distinctive over time. Well, now time to explicitly connect partial full continuum with the pluremic and synemic contrast. Earlier slide listed 4 mid-level binaries as being quite elusive, but when we unclutter from the inappropriate terms and with rearranging, I hope we can see that the connections are plainly manifest here. Morphographic is pluremic. It's a partial, right? So morphography alone can only materialize partial writing. Pluremic, semantically informed mapping as a principle of graphematic representation is simply not feasible for all of the morphemes of a language due to their sheer numbers. So 15, morphographic writing systems can only expand from partial to full writing as a component of a mixed writing system. Moreover, only 2 possible expansion strategies available: either to develop conventions for using the existing signs for synemic mappings, which is basically what the Chinese writing system has done, or supplement a morphographic grapheme inventory with separate phonographic subsystem to handle synemic mappings, which is essentially what the Japanese writing system has done. 16, conversely, many phonographic writing systems also require pluremic mapping strategies for lexical distinctions, reflecting natural constraints on the phonological inventories of languages. Even phonographic writing systems need to deal with inventory gaps and lexical differentiation issues, i.e. dealing with homophones. So 17, given the prevalence of mixed writing systems, topology should abandon the single term classification labels. In that respect, Nana Deshigan's 2017 topology of phonemic scripts is undoubtedly marking a significant advance in that direction. So we can see some of the examples there of the descriptions. 18, still to be more fully elucidate mixed writing systems, synemic pluremic terms most expedient for describing mappings. Succinct forms of expression are of immense value cognitively, so synemic mapping is a concise shorthand for what could be expressed in the following sentence. Okay, this final section attempts to underscore how a morphographic writing system can only expand from a partial to a full writing by becoming a component of a mixed writing system that sanctifies both pluremic and synemic mappings. Like the vast majority of cultures, Japan did not invent writing independently. Rather, the raw materials for 3 of the 4 scripts that are used of contemporary writing system, to be introduced in a moment, were Chinese characters. However, most of the following brief descriptions of Chinese characters will be introduced from the perspective of modern Japanese kanji in terms of their phonological values. So turning to the Japanese writing system, well, contemporary writing system is well renowned for its complexity. A few quotes to illustrate that. The Japanese people ended up with one of the worst overall writing systems ever created, was de Francis's assessment, or Splout 2010 has commented Japanese is a complex system, certainly the most complex writing system in use today, and a contender for the title of the most complex system ever used. And Dedekind also makes a similar comment, the most complicated writing system in modern use. However, she also, in her title of her chapter on the Japanese writing system, also observes that maybe writing multiple scripts may actually be better than one. 20. The mixed nature of modern Japanese writing system is actually explicitly acknowledged in the standard term for the language, kanji, majiri, kanji kana, majiri bun. And what are the main components? Well, kanji, morphography. Now there are 2,136 kanji that are prescribed for official use. However, there are about 6,355 on most people's devices, smartphones, computers. Also, they emerged 2 kana systems, the Hiragana and Katakana. These are both syllabographic, and there are 107 Hiragana and 168 Katakana, which were expanded for loanword mappings. And increasingly, there's use of Romanji, Roman Latin letters, segmental. So in that case, the standard alphabet plus macrons to indicate long vowels would be sufficient, but also they basically will write any orthographic writing system, so they use all the kinds of diacritics that exist in alphabets. 21, abridged outline of the contemporary writing system evolution 1, mainly from the perspective of the Mathematic Mapping. All extinct writing systems trace back ultimately to just 2 independent inventions, the Sumerian cuneiform, the Chinese characters. Both emerged from pictorial representations, initially followed similar development trajectories, but the Chinese characters remained predominantly morphographic writing system with the conventions for synonymic mappings, which we're going to note in a moment. So the outline bridged, second point, other morphemic kanji. So there are both Sino-Japanese morphemes, which are a byproduct of the lexical stratum being adopted with the Chinese characters. These are predominantly the bound elements of compound words, and they became also associated with native Japanese words as they were borrowed. So basically, pictogram examples, tree, a key, or yama, a mountain. I'm taking this example of the key, no longer a kanji with that meaning, but it can be used for that. Or ideographic, where we make a small tally mark or something, so that's just 1, ichi, or we put a mark on tree to indicate the base, moto. But I want you to note how very few Joyo kanji are according to these principles, due to the fundamental limitations on their representational potentiality. I think this is of something of profound significance for prevalent confusions about the potentiality of emoji. Next point is the initial emergence of synonymic mapping strategies for Chinese characters. Well, the rebus principle. As Robinson astutely observes, the possibility of full writing emerges from the intersection between a highly developed avenues for human perception, visual iconic, and auditory symbolic perception, namely the rebus principle, which de Francis has stressed as the key for the partial full writing transitions. As he glosses it, a pictographic symbol was used not for its original meaning value, but specifically to represent the sound evoked by the name of the symbol. That is, phonemic mapping, a semantically informed pictogram word becomes a synonymic mapping, a semantically empty grapheme to word. So how did that apply? Well, basically, as we said, we have this willowing basket pictogram comes to be used for a synonymic mapping for the word that in Chinese, but mapping the intersection within the evolution of Chinese characters, it's crucially significant that the phonetic compounds, case emoji, where a semantic phonetic marker, an onpu, is combined with a semantic marker, bushu in Japanese, a polemic element, which actually created new polemic graphemes. So when we add it with soil, we get the sense of moto. When we add it with ki, we can have a meaning for chess piece, ki. When we add it with bamboo, take, we get then back to ki, mi. And this third one is needed because it needs to differentiate between the plonymic and synonymic uses of the ki kanji. So setting aside any additional forms of synonymic mapping within, a brief aside on the additional forms of synonymic mapping within the Chinese writing system. Understandably, compounding, the combining of morphemes is a main process of word formation for morphographic writing systems, more on that soon. So although some loan words have been rendered by plonymic mappings, a semantic translation, so apparently the word for computer, well, actually is the word in Japanese, keisan, ki, electric calculate machine, or apparently informally, tenno. But also necessary to resort to synonymic mappings, so from Sanskrit, nahan for nirvana, or the Chinese word, Chinese unicorn became kirin, using that key element, or we have now apparently a modern word for blog. But compounding is the most productive process of word formation with Japanese characters. So most kanji are allomorphic, associated with the native Japanese and Sino-Japanese. So we have mizu or fusegu, meaning water and defend, but they're associated with sui and bo. But we can see how they can recreate productively in bosui, waterproofing, or yobo, prevention, and then further formations. And then turning to the notion of Japan's partial to full solution, well, emergence of two phonographic scripts, the kana. Similar to the Chinese strategy for synonymic mapping, Japanese also initially used kanji for synonymic mappings in the Manyoshu, an anthology of Japanese verse, circa 8th century Common Era. However, the two kana scripts developed in separate ways. Katakana developed from scribal practices of Buddhist priests as they were tending to abbreviate the graphemes as they were making notes and singling out a single element. So these are the kind of correspondence that we could see for the first vowels and the first consonant plus vowel sounds. But hiragana evolved through a distinct stages of cursive writing. So some of the characters overlap, such as the one for u, but some of them were very different because of the different processes. And so what do we have? We have the Japanese writing system with a graphematic mappings and script mixture. But this mix of mappings and script is generally used together in largely separate and complementary ways, such that kanji are polemic, and they're used for both the native and Sino-Japanese content morphemes. Hiragana used for native grammatical morphemes. Katakana, the distinction is for foreign Japanese words, loan words, and Romaji is assumed to be for foreign words, although not always the case. But it also does warrant stressing that this unique mixing of potentialities, the full and partial of graphematic mappings, and the mixture of scripts means that graphematic variation is a pervasive characteristic of the Japanese writing system. So just for some closing remarks, the core claim being repeated, the partial full dichotomy of deep significance for writing system topologies. I think the first section on the scope tried to briefly illustrate how the partial full is a binary, and as a sharp dichotomy, it appropriately demarks the key boundary between semiotics and the topology. So clearly, certainly a clear ramifications of that all forms of semasiography, such as emoji, only constitute forms of non-writing warrants wider appreciation. I think we all agree on that. The core proposal was basically a call to utilize polemic and synemic as a cognitively succinct shorthand for graphematic mappings. More specifically, the middle section advocated the following points: the partial full binary is a continuum within glottographic writing systems. The full, partial plus full, and polemic, synemic are closely interconnected, such that the polemic mapping alone cannot materialize a full writing. So topology should abandon single-term classification labels that fail to convey the mixed nature of writing systems, and the polemic synemic terms can greatly expedite a greater attention to the graphematic mappings of lexical units. And then finally, the Japanese writing system was used as a case study, illustrating the only options for realizing that shift from partial to full writing. Although the Chinese adopted strategies for synemic mappings, the rebus, as they were applied to create phonetic compound characters, they effectively really created new polemic graphemes. However, in contrast, the Japanese writing system pursued the alternative option of supplementing the polemic kanji with separate phonographic systems, i.e. the two kana systems, or to dealing with the synemic mappings for grammatical elements, hiragana, and coping with loanwords, katakana. So I think there is growing consensus that morphography is a more appropriate term for the alternative to phonography as a positive step. As the partial full section tried to illustrate, as morphography alone can only materialize partial writing, as both the Chinese and Japanese writing systems testify, perhaps the next modest step is to gain greater recognition for that reality. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Terry. We have a question by Richard Sprout.
Okay, let me see if I can ask this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, this is really a minor question to your main point, but you mentioned Sumerian as the source of everything that wasn't from Chinese, but I was always under the impression that came from the Sinaitic scripts, which themselves were influenced by Egyptian. So I'm wondering what I'm wondering what you're assuming the path was from Sumerian, which I thought was largely a dead end.
I do. I know that you don't, and you're kind of open to that. I think there's still argument on that, although there hasn't been consensus reached on that. I'm not fully committed to that, but basically, if we assume that there were also the Mayan and the Sumerian and these as the originals, then there's only two extinct, or at least a trajectory. I'm not making a hard point on that. Yeah, no, it's a valid point. It's, as you say, a minor point, I hope.
Yeah, minor. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Yes, it's Gordon Berthand. Thank you for a very informative presentation. Could you clarify the point that you made about emojis? I understood it that they are considered a non-writing system.
Well, yeah, I must confess that this has been very late in the preparation of the presentation, and I'm very, very tired. I've been up from a long time to do this. I'm not sure I'll make the full day, but no. I did want to include that more on that, but I ended up jettisoning it out of time, and I realized that actually what I had there was going to take up the whole time. But I do think what we really have to understand is there has to be a consensus-based relationship to language for emoji to work. You know, you can draw a picture of a tree and in the right context understand it means tree. But, you know, I didn't cite it, but the co-authored paper with Demetrius, his supervisor, Christiana, they have pointed out an example of I'm with a walking character, person in motion. What does that mean? I walked, I'm walking, right? You have to have a link, I think, to language and all the units. And I hope that really, in a sense, the trajectory of Japanese shows that that was a whole struggle, right? I haven't gone into how the details of why the kana emerged for grammatical elements, but it was needed for that language. And most languages will need that. Yeah, a representation of grammatical as well as semantic. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much.